She stood at the edge of the ballroom and felt the cold truth wrap around her like a winter fog. The music was a golden wave, violins and candlelight and the rustle of silk. But Alara Waverley, Duchess of Thornwood, was not part of any of it. She had become a shadow in her own life. Her husband, Cassian Vale, the Duke of Thornwood, stood not 10 feet away. His back was to her, broad and elegant in his midnight coat. He was laughing softly at something a beautiful widow murmured close to his ear. His head was tilted in a way that made Alara's stomach clench, because she had never once been the reason for that expression. She had been his wife for 2 years, 7 months and 14 days. And he had never once looked at her the way he was looking at that stranger now. Alara gripped her champagne flute until her knuckles ached. She had worn the silver gown he once mentioned in passing months ago when she had asked his opinion on a fabric swatch. He had glanced at it and said it was a fine color. She had clung to that single word like a lifeline. Tonight she had dressed for him, hoping he might notice, hoping he might finally see her. But he had walked past her in the entrance hall without a word. His gaze had swept over her like she was a piece of furniture. Now, as the widow touched his sleeve and his smile deepened, something inside Alara splintered. She did not cry. She had learned long ago that tears changed nothing. Instead, she set down her glass very carefully, turned, and walked out of the ballroom. No one noticed her leave. The cold night air struck her cheeks as she stepped onto the terrace. The stars were terribly bright, indifferent, and Alara realized with a kind of hollow clarity that she could not keep bleeding for a man who refused to see her wounds. Something had to change. And it would. The marriage had begun with silence. Alara remembered the day she first met the Duke of Thornwood. She had been 20 years old, the daughter of a baron with more land than fortune, and she had been told her hand would save her family. The Duke needed an heir, eventually, and a wife of respectable blood, and her father needed a debt erased. It was a business arrangement dressed in lace and vows. But Alara had hoped. She had seen Cassian Vale from across the drawing room, tall, dark-haired, with gray eyes that held a winter stillness, and her heart had stumbled. He was the most compelling man she had ever seen. And when he bowed over her hand, his voice low and careful, something foolish and tender had taken root inside her. She had believed, with all the naivety of a young woman raised on stories, that love could grow from duty. The wedding was grand. The first weeks were polite. He was never unkind. He simply was not there. He spent his days riding, managing the vast estate, attending to Parliament business. When they dined together, he asked courteous questions about her health, the household, the weather. He never asked about her heart. He never came to her room. Alara tried everything. She learned his favorite foods and had them prepared. She read the books he mentioned so she could discuss them. She dressed carefully, spoke softly, smiled even when her heart was aching. She waited up for him on nights he went to his club, a candle burning in the window until her eyes grew heavy and the flame died. He never noticed. In the first year, she told herself he was simply reserved, a man of duty, not emotion. The Thornwood Duchy had a reputation for coldness. His own father had been famously distant. Cassian was formed by that stone. She only needed patience. But patience has a breaking point. It came on an evening in late autumn during a dinner at Thornwood Hall. A few of Cassian's closest friends had gathered: Lord Harrow, Sir William, and Lady Margaret, a sharp-eyed cousin who had never bothered to hide her disdain for the new Duchess. Alara had tried to be a gracious hostess, and for a while she thought she had succeeded. The meal went smoothly. The conversation was lively. Then Cassian excused himself to the library with the gentleman for brandy, and Alara was left with Lady Margaret. She did not mean to eavesdrop. She had gone to return a book to the library, assuming the men had moved elsewhere. But as she approached the half-open door, she heard Lord Harrow's voice, lazy and amused. "Come now, Thornwood. You cannot be as indifferent to your pretty wife as you seem." Alara's hand froze on the doorframe. Cashin's reply came after a pause. His voice was quiet, measured, and utterly devastating. I married her for duty, nothing more. She is a requirement of my position. I have given her my name and my protection. That is all I promised. That is all she will ever receive. There was no anger in his tone. That was the worst part. It was simple truth, spoken as casually as a remark about the weather. Ilara felt the blood drain from her face. She stood there for a long, shaking moment, the book forgotten in her hands. Then she turned and walked away, her slippers making no sound on the marble floor. She did not cry that night. She sat in the window seat of her bedchamber and watched the moon climb above the gardens, and she let the hope inside her die very, very quietly. Something in her shifted after that night. The pain did not vanish, it settled into her bones, a dull ache she learned to carry. But she stopped trying to earn love that would never be given. She stopped choosing her gowns based on his preferences. She stopped waiting up. When he returned late, the candle was no longer in the window. At first, Cashin did not notice. He was accustomed to her quiet presence, her soft questions, her careful attempts to draw him into conversation. When those attempts faded, the silence felt almost the same to him. But weeks passed, and small changes accumulated like fallen leaves. One morning he walked into the breakfast room and found her already seated, reading a letter, her tea cooling beside her. She glanced up and offered a polite smile, the kind one gives an acquaintance, and returned to her reading. No questions about his sleep. No hopeful offer to accompany him on his ride. He frowned slightly but said nothing. The next week he saw her in the garden from his study window. She was walking with the head gardener, gesturing toward the old rose beds, her expression animated. She was discussing plans for replanting, he later learned. She had always been fond of the gardens, but she had never before taken such direct interest. She had spent her days trying to please him. Now she was doing something for herself. The week after that, she did not appear at dinner. A servant informed him the Duchess was visiting one of the tenant families who had a sick child. She had taken broth and medicine. Cashin ate alone at the long table, the empty chair across from him feeling strangely large. He told himself he was relieved. He had always found her earnest attention exhausting. He preferred solitude. This was better. But the hallway outside her room was dark when he passed it that night, and the silence felt different. He could not name why. Ilara discovered that helping others eased a wound she could not heal alone. The tenant farms on the Thornwood estate had been neglected for years. Cashin was a fair landlord but a distant one. His steward handled the details. Ilara began visiting the families, learning their needs, arranging for repairs to cottages, medicine for the elderly. She spent her own small allowance on blankets and seed and a new roof for the widow's cottage. The people began to speak of her with warmth, and that warmth was a balm she had not expected. She also began to spend more time in the village. She helped organize a small school for the children. She sat with the vicar's wife and planned a harvest supper. She laughed more than she had in years, a genuine laugh that reached her eyes. And as her world expanded, the walls of Thornwood Hall felt less like a cage. She was not merely the Duke's invisible wife. She was becoming someone in her own right. 6 months after that library night, an old friend came to visit. His name was Nicholas Ashby, now Viscount Ashby after his father's passing. He had known Ilara since childhood, when they had chased each other through the meadows of her family's estate. He was kind-eyed, easy with his smiles, and he had never treated her as invisible. He arrived on a bright autumn afternoon, and Ilara greeted him on the front steps with genuine delight. She took his hands, and he kissed her cheek, and they walked together into the gardens, talking and laughing as if the years between had never existed. Cashin saw them from his study window. He had returned early from a meeting in London, and the sight of his wife, with her hand resting on another man's arm, her face lifted in a smile that was pure sunlight, stopped him mid-step. He stood motionless behind the glass, watching. She had never smiled at him like that. Something hot and unfamiliar twisted in his chest. He recognized it distantly, like a language he had not spoken in years. Jealousy. He turned away from the window, jaw tight. It was nothing. Ashby was a family friend. She was simply being polite. But when Alara did not appear at dinner that evening, she sent word that she and Lord Ashby were dining with the vicar. Cashin's appetite vanished. He stared at the empty table and felt the first cold thread of unease wrap around his heart. Nicholas stayed for a week. Every day, Alara seemed brighter, busier, farther away. She rode with him across the moors. She showed him the new school. She introduced him to the tenants. And Cashin watched from the edges of his own home, a stranger to the life unfolding without him. One evening, he found himself standing outside the music room. Alara was inside with Nicholas, and she was playing the pianoforte, a piece she had once tried to play for Cashin years ago before she had stopped trying. He had been too busy that evening. He had walked past the door without entering. Now through the crack of the door he saw Nicholas turn the pages of the music for her. He saw Alara glance up and smile. And Cashin felt, for the first time, the full weight of his own absence. He had believed she would always be there, waiting, hopping. He had taken her presence for granted like the air he breathed. But air can thin, air can vanish. And the Duchess was learning to breathe on her own. The turning point came on a cold, rain-lashed night. Nicholas had departed that morning, and Alara had been quieter than usual, but there was a new steadiness in her. She no longer looked at Cashin with longing or pain. She looked at him with something far more terrifying: peace, acceptance. Cashin found her in the small sitting room she had made her own, a fire crackling, a book open in her lap. She did not startle when he entered. She simply looked up. "Your Grace," she said, formal, distant, "is something needed." He did not know why that word, needed, cut so deeply. He had never needed anything from her, had he? "Ashby has left," he said, "for lack of anything else." "Yes," her tone was neutral. "He sends his regards." Silence stretched between them. Cashin moved to the window, his back to her, his reflection a dark shape against the rain. "You have been occupied lately." "The estate keeps me busy, and the tenants. I have found purpose." Purpose, not love, not him. He turned. She was watching him calmly, and he saw it then, the absence of the soft, hopeful light that used to live in her eyes. It was gone, completely gone. She had given up on him, and the realization struck him like a physical blow. "I have been neglectful," he said, the words strange and stiff on his tongue. He did not know how to do this. He had never learned. Alara closed her book. "You have been as you always were. I have simply stopped expecting what you cannot give." The honesty was merciless. He flinched, but she did not look away. "Is there nothing?" He stopped. What could he ask for? He had no right. She stood. "I am not angry, Cashin. I am not bitter. I have simply accepted the truth." She walked toward the door, then paused and looked back at him. "You married me for duty. I understand that now. But I am more than a duty, and I will not spend the rest of my life waiting to be seen." She left. The door closed softly. Cashin stood alone in the firelight, her words echoing in the hollow space she left behind. He did not sleep that night. He sat in his study and stared at the dark windows, and for the first time in years, the Duke of Thornwood allowed himself to feel the one emotion he had spent a lifetime avoiding: regret. Deep, aching, bone-cold regret. The days that followed were a slow, quiet agony. Alara was never unkind. She was perfectly civil, perfectly composed, perfectly absent. She no longer sought his company, but she did not avoid him either. She simply existed in a world he was no longer part of. And the more she slipped away, the more he felt her absence like a missing limb. He found himself lingering in doorways, hopping to catch a glimpse of her. He took a sudden interest in the estate improvements so he could ask her about the tenant cottages. He attended the harvest supper in the village just to watch her move among the people, her smile warm and easy, her laugh light. She was beloved there. She had built a life without him. One afternoon he came upon her in the garden, kneeling in the soil, planting lavender. There was dirt on her cheek, and her hair was coming loose from its pins, and she was humming something soft. She looked up and saw him, and for a brief instant he thought he saw a flicker of the old hope. But it was only surprise. "Your Grace, did you need something?" That word again, need. "No," he said hoarsely. "I only wanted to see you." Something shifted in her expression, a flicker of confusion, perhaps a ghost of pain, but she smoothed it away and returned to her planting. "You are welcome to stay, of course." He did. He stood there like a fool, watching her work, and she did not speak again. The silence was not hostile. It was worse. It was indifferent. That night, driven by a despair he could not name, Cashin went to her sitting room. She was not there. The fire had burned low. On her writing desk, tucked beneath a stack of household ledgers, he saw a ribbon-bound bundle of papers. He knew he should not look. He looked. They were letters, dozens of them, each addressed in her careful hand. To him. Letters she had written and never sent. His hands trembled as he untied the ribbon and unfolded the first one, dated 4 months after their wedding. "My dear Cashin, I write this because I cannot say the words aloud. When you look at me, I feel invisible, but I have hope. I see the man you hide, and I believe with all my foolish heart that one day you might let me in. Until then, I will be patient. I will be constant. I will wait." He read another from a year later. "You passed me in the hall today and did not speak. I think you did not even see me. I am trying so hard to be a good wife. I do not know what I have done wrong. Please, just once, tell me what I can do to make you care." And another, written only 6 months ago. "I am tired. I have spent so long trying to reach you, but you are a wall of stone. I cannot break through. I no longer know if I even want to. I think I am losing myself in loving you. I think I must find myself again, even if it means letting you go." Cashin's vision blurred. The letters were not angry, they were wounded. They were a record of a heart breaking slowly, day by day, in the same house where he had slept peacefully. He had done this. His coldness, his distance, his silence, he had chipped away at her soul until there was nothing left. And now she had rebuilt herself without him. He pressed the letters to his chest and closed his eyes. And for the first time since boyhood, the Duke of Thornwood wept. The next morning, Alara received a message that made her blood run cold. She was in the village at the school when a rider came with news. The Duke had been thrown from his horse on the North Ridge. He was alive but injured. They were bringing him to the hall. The world tilted. All the careful distance she had built, all the acceptance, crumbled in an instant. She ran. She ran through the muddy lanes and the garden paths and the great doors of Thornwood Hall, her heart a frantic drum, her lungs burning. She found him in his bedchamber, pale against the pillows, a gash on his temple, his arm bound. The physician was still there. Cashin's eyes were closed. "Is he?" Her voice broke. "He will recover, Your Grace. He struck his head and broke his arm, but there is no danger. He is resting." Alara sank into the chair beside the bed. She did not think. She simply took his hand, his cold, unresponsive hand, and held it. She did not know how long she sat there. The afternoon light faded. Servants came and went. And then, in the quiet, his fingers stirred against hers. She looked up. His gray eyes were open, hazy with pain but fixed on her face. "Alara," he whispered. It was the first time in months he had spoken her name without formality. "You came." "Of course I came." Her voice was thick. "You are my husband." He closed his eyes, and a single tear slipped down his temple. "I do not deserve that word." She did not know what to say, so she said nothing. She stayed. Over the days of his recovery, something fragile began to shift. Cashin was a different man in his weakness, quieter, rawer. He watched her constantly. He accepted her care with a gratitude that seemed to pain him. And one evening, when the fire burned low and the house was silent, he spoke. "I overheard you once," he said, his voice rasping, "at a funeral before we were married." Elara froze. "What funeral?" "Your cousin's, the naval officer. You were standing by the grave and you said, 'I will never love anyone again.'" He swallowed. I believed your heart was buried with him. I thought you had been forced into this marriage, that you resented me for taking the place of the man you truly loved." Elara stared at him. The memory surfaced slowly, her cousin William, who had been more brother than cousin, lost at sea. She had been grief-stricken, yes, but she had never loved him as a woman loves a man. And the words she had spoken, half to herself in the rain, had been a child's desperate cry. She had been 19. She had been mourning a friend. "Cassian," she said, her voice trembling, "William was my family. I loved him like a brother. I never loved anyone else. From the day I met you, there was only you." His face went utterly still, then the color drained from it. "All this time," he breathed, "all this time I believed." "You believed a lie," her eyes burned, "and you punished me for it." He tried to rise, but pain stopped him. I was trying to give you space. I did not want to impose a husband you never wanted. I thought if I stayed distant, you would not feel trapped. I was a coward. I was so afraid of loving you and seeing hatred in your eyes that I chose to feel nothing. But you did feel something." He met her gaze and the mask was gone, utterly gone. "Yes, I loved you from the first moment, and it terrified me." The confession hung in the air, raw and unpolished. Elara felt her heart crack open, the old pain and the new hope tangling together. She had wanted to hear those words for so long, and now they came too late, or perhaps just in time. "I loved you," she said softly, "for years, until I had nothing left." He flinched as if struck. "Is it truly gone? Is there nothing left of it?" She looked at him, this proud, broken man who had been a stranger in her own home. She thought of the letters in his desk, the tears that had stained them. She thought of the long, lonely nights and the slow rebuilding of her soul. And she thought of the terror that had seized her when she heard he was hurt, a terror that had no room for pride or distance. "I do not know," she said honestly, "but I am here." It was not forgiveness, not yet, but it was a beginning. The weeks that followed were not a fairy tale. Healing is slow, and wounds do not vanish with a single confession. Cassian had to learn to speak. He had to learn to stay. He began to accompany Elara on her visits to the tenants, awkward and stiff at first, but gradually finding his place. He began to ask about her day and mean it. He began to wait for her in the evenings, a candle in the window, because he wanted her to know someone was waiting. And Elara had to learn to trust again. She had to let down the walls she had built, brick by careful brick. She had to risk the pain of hope. One evening, in the garden where the lavender had taken root, Cassian took her hand, not as a duke to a duchess, as a man to the woman he loved. "I know I have no right to ask," he said, his voice rough, "but if there is even a seed of love left in your heart, I will spend the rest of my life tending it. I will not fail you again." Elara looked at their joined hands. She thought of the girl who had waited by the window, who had written letters that were never sent, who had learned to live without love. And she thought of the woman she had become, stronger, wiser, still capable of hope. She lifted her gaze to his. "Then do not fail me." He pulled her gently into his arms and she let him. The embrace was not desperate. It was a quiet, steady thing, like a door closing on a long winter. Above them, the first stars began to appear. The air smelled of lavender and turned earth. And for the first time in 3 years, Elara felt the cold inside her begin to thaw. She did not know what the future held, but she knew she would not face it invisible, not anymore. Cassian held her as if she were the most precious thing in his world, and he whispered against her hair, "I see you, Elara, I see you." And at last she believed him. The Duchy of Thornwood did not transform overnight, but season by season, the great house itself seemed to breathe differently. Laughter began to drift from windows that had been silent for years. The Duke and Duchess walked the grounds together, not always speaking, but close. The tenants said the Stone Lord had finally found his heart, and they credited the Duchess entirely. Alara never forgot the pain. She did not wish to. It had shaped her, refined her, taught her that love cannot be begged for, it can only be given and received freely. The letters she had written were never mentioned again, but Cassian kept them in a locked drawer, a private reminder of what his silence had nearly cost. And on the anniversary of the day he had finally spoken his truth, he led her to the garden where the lavender had grown thick and fragrant. There, beneath the stars, he knelt, not as a duke, not as a proud man, but as a husband who had almost lost everything, and he placed into her hands a simple ring. "I married you with duty," he said. "Let me marry you again with love." Alara looked at the ring, then at the man who had once been a stranger. Her eyes glistened, but she smiled, a full and luminous smile that reached every corner of her soul. "Yes," she said, "always yes." And as the night wrapped around them, gentle and kind, the last of the ice melted away, and the promise of a new morning began.